Hey, my name is Matt Storr and I repair saxophones for a living. And this video is really aimed at a very, very small subset of even like the self-selected people who watch this channel regularly, um, and are kind of dorky about saxophone repair and about saxophone mechanics. Even a smaller subset than that. This is really for people that know how to repair and are tasked with doing a Conn 26M or a 30M. This is about some really specific stuff that's only useful if you're overhauling one of those. I made it because I'm super lucky to get to work on a ton of those, and they're not as I wouldn't say easy, it's not self-evident how to set them up because they're so different from other horns. So unless you get really, really lucky like me and get to see a ton of them, including ones that are like in original condition, it's not super intuitive to set them up the right way. And so I get a lot of calls from all over the world, people looking to get their 26 or 30Ms repaired. And so I see a lot of them, but I know that there's a need out there that is unfulfilled. And I know that there's repairers that, would possibly benefit from what I have learned. Now, what I'm about to show you is not like the only way to do these horns, but it seems like compared to, the sort of absence of information, giving a little bit of information would be better than none. So unless you fit that description, I would probably say don't watch this video. It's going to be very boring. It's going to be very, very long. But for the few people for whom this is useful, or possibly useful, please let me know if it helped you, and if there's any more questions you've got. These horns, these 26Ms and 30Ms, they're fantastic saxophones when they're set up right, but they can be pretty difficult to get there if they didn't sort of start that way, right? If they've been messed with, if they've seen several layers of repair, the farther from factory condition they are, the more difficult it is to get the geometry correct and to get everything operating the way it should. When it does, it's a really, really amazing horn. And that left-hand pinky table feels incredible, particularly the low C sharp is just like the best on any saxophone anywhere. But they took an interesting route to get there. And like I said, it's not super intuitive. A lot of saxophones will tell you what they need. The 26M and 30Ms, say it a little quieter. So hopefully this is helpful. Hey, my name is Matt Storr and I repair saxophones for a living, and I am extremely lucky to see a lot of really rare horns, and one of the ones I see a ton, relative to, I think, most people's experience, is Conn 30M and 26M saxophones. And I've got here a Conn 30M, and I honestly don't know, I've probably overhauled maybe a couple dozen Connqueror saxophones, and they're pretty rare, and they're also very particular. They're kind of unusual. Oops, it looks like I forgot to take out a pivot screw. Oh, and I'm missing this guy. I'm just noticing that. So I'm just showing you what I'm dealing with. This video is going to be about the adjustment materials on a Conn 30M. And a lot of that is going to apply to a 26M as well. They're slightly different in a couple places, but a lot of this is going to apply to a 26M as well. And I'm just showing you here what we're starting with. This saxophone is pretty beat up and very dirty. Hasn't really been apart, I think, in decades and decades. And it's going to be a pretty big job, but it should be a rewarding one. And I'm really lucky that I've seen a lot of these, because, this will be a big job on its own as far as just getting it, back to decent physical condition. But if I weren't lucky enough to see a lot of these instruments, this would be a very, very big ask, I think, for someone to bring one of these into a repairer that hadn't seen a lot of these before. And I would like to share some of my good fortune by going through the adjustment materials and how they're applied to the saxophone. It's actually a different order of operations. If you haven't watched it yet, I would suggest watching my video on the overview of these instruments, where I give a bit more of a general overview on the instruments themselves. This is going to be specific for people that are actually working on them and how the adjustment materials go together on this saxophone, which has an unusual mechanism and is put together differently than any other saxophone and has a lot of unique things about it. So hopefully this will be helpful, useful, and informative if you find yourself needing to overhaul one of these and you haven't done it before. All right, so here we are a little while later where I've cleaned everything up and I've mounted all the adjustment materials. And the thing that is unusual about this instrument, about the Conn 26M and 30M instruments, is that the relationships between the materials, between the keys, is modified not by changing the adjustment materials themselves, but by changing these little perm-adjust feet. You unscrew this locking screw here, and then this can screw in and out, up and down. And that's what actually changes the relationship between the keys. So this is the A key, and this controls the height. Sorry, this controls the height of that key, right? And then where it interacts with the C sharp, with the bar key, is right here. And that relationship, I've got a little bit of material here, is controlled by this adjustment foot here. So unlike most saxophones, you mount all the, and there's different order of operations for different people. Some people do put on most of their adjustment materials first and then modify them later. Some people do the pads first and then adjustment materials, and most people I think do something halfway between. But on these instruments, it really is adjustment materials and then pads. So I'm going to go through all of the keys to show what that looks like so that you can do it. If you've got one of these instruments, you know what things can look like, maybe should look like. Now, obviously, my way of doing it is just one way of doing it, but hopefully if you've got one of these on your bench in front of you and you're not sure exactly what to do, this will be helpful. So start off, I'm going to go key by key. Some of them don't have materials on them, just like this one. This is the neck octave key, and it doesn't need anything. It's going to have this little spring here. Make sure that that's in good operating condition. But other than that, no adjustment material. Sometimes people will put like Teflon on the inside of these, but if this is smooth, I don't think you really need that. Next up is the body octave key. Now, also, again, sometimes people will put, I gotta get my stuff down here. Sometimes people will put Teflon on this surface right here because that's where the G comes down on it. But if this is smooth, I don't think you actually need that. Let's do some side keys. So this is side C. I put a nice, make sure that these jaws here are like square. And then I put a nice thick piece of cork here. Some people use a lot of synthetic materials. I used to, I don't anymore. You'll see that there's a lot of cork on here. Over time, I've not really found that anything holds up better than cork. It's resistant to oil, it's resistant to water. It doesn't compress over time, although people say it does. If you cut it correctly, I've got a video about that. It really doesn't. It seems to outlast pretty much anything else. So a lot of times these days, I'm just using high quality cork if I can find it, or if I can make it work where I want it to work. So make sure these jaws are square on your side C and your side B flat. This one has a very thin top jaw here, and this was bent pretty bad, so I was really worried when I bent it back to parallel that it was going to break off, but it did not. So I got another thick piece of cork there. And then the way I do these keys, I do take synthetic felt on the top and bottom here, and I put on thicker stuff that I need, and then I shave it down with a razor blade to where it's just holding it, right? It's got enough flex that it is not going to cause that to bind, but it will operate it without there being any noise. And I've got that on both of these keys here. And that is also the same way to do it on a Conn 10M. So there's those two. And then you've got your high E. And so far we haven't gotten into any of the stuff that's really too weird. This is the high E. This typically, because there's a tiny bit, it's like a pretty small touch piece, or not touch piece. It's a pretty small area where the adjustment material hits the body of the horn, and it can compress a whole lot. So I actually use synthetic cork. It's one of the few places I'll use it on this horn, laminated with some synthetic felt to give it a little bit of give and quiet it down, but not compress too much. Here we go to the octave key. This is also the same as a Conn 10M. I've got a shaped piece of cork here. And when I get this on the instrument, I can, sand this down to make this lower key height if I want to. And this is the other piece of the octave key. I've got a piece of cork here. Sometimes I'll put felt there. It kind of just depends on my mood. Make sure these jaws are parallel. And then here, this is a little different than normal. Someone filed off the edges. Usually there's a little channel cut here versus it being flat. Someone filed it flat, so it's just a flat piece here. But basically, I did the same thing I usually do, where I put a piece of cork here and I round it off, and then I wrap it with a piece of Teflon. And so that means no matter what the actual angle is of the neck, like the rounding of this means it's going to hit like a similarly shaped area when this gets activated. If you have it square on the edges, depending on how people have things set up, sometimes you can have it like sort of grab or not be very smooth. And that's something I try to avoid. So a lot of times you'll see, as we go forward here, you'll see that I round corks over sometimes. All right, next let's do the low C, E flat, and F sharp. Again, this is similar, basically the same as the Conn 10M. I put a piece of felt on the bottom here. So you can do cork if you want, but sometimes I find that that makes a lot of noise, like it kind of slaps. So I put a piece of felt there because it's a little quieter. The C gets nothing. The E flat gets something on the bottom right here. You can do just cork, or you can do just felt. I did cork with a lamination of synthetic felt, and that'll be pretty firm, but also should be quiet. One of the things that can happen sometimes is, that can sort of slap a bit, especially like if this isn't completely fit, which you want it to be, or even if it is like really, really well fit, sometimes that amount of like twist and pressure can cause this to kind of rock a bit and make noise, especially after the oil starts to thin out or dry out, or if you don't use really thick oil to start with. So having something that is not going to, hit too hard and make tons of noise is a good thing to do there. Again, moving to stuff that is not significantly different or different at all really from the 10M. Here is the front F rocker. Now, if this is rough, this is original here. So this was originally smooth. When these came from the factory, they didn't put materials here. But sometimes people will put materials here and they'll rough up this surface. If that's happened, I usually put Teflon on top, but if it's nice and smooth like this, I won't bother. For the F, got a nice thick piece of cork here. And again, we've got a piece of cork that I've rounded over and then laminated with Teflon. And that is where that, front F is going to move. And so as it like moves through its range of motion, it's going to be touching a different part of that, right? And so rounding it over really makes that smooth and makes it so it doesn't catch or get gummy. And it's very, very smooth and very, very firm and positive feel. Here is the palm D, nice big fat piece of cork there. And again, these I can modify afterwards by sanding them down if I want to. The E flat, again, this is kind of like the side E where you've got a sort of a lot of force on a fairly small area. So this is another spot where I've got some synthetic cork laminated with synthetic felt to give me sort of the best of both worlds as far as firmness without being too mushy or being able to be compressed by the amount of force people put. All right, let's move on to the upper stack. Got the bis key here. The only thing I usually do to this is put some Teflon on this little piece here. Also, make sure that this is like bent in an arc. Sometimes this will be completely flat, and that sort of makes the relationship between the lower stack and the upper stack limited. If you bend this down a little bit, you have a little bit of arc in the bottom, that kind of gives you a bit more leeway as far as the adjustment there with the F sharp impinging, or the F sharp touching the bis, and a little bit of a bend seems to make that work a lot better. But I usually put a little bit of Teflon here. Even if this is nice and smooth, that is kind of like a weird angle, and the Teflon seems to really help that move through its range of motion without getting caught up. Here's the G. I use a piece of felt on the bottom here. You can also use cork. I find that felt slides a little better than cork. You can do cork laminated with Teflon, but then sometimes I find that slaps. Makes noise. So usually I do a piece of felt here, and that is going to be, going against the, let's see, where are you? There it is. This is going to be on this, right? And opening and closing. And it's, when the octave key isn't depressed, it just, this opens and closes on it. When the octave key is depressed, the octave key will open with it, and we kind of want a little bit of sliding motion there. And that's really, really easy to do with felt. So here we go to the upper stack, and this is where things start to get a little different. So I'll put a piece of felt on the bottom of the front F and a piece of cork laminated with Teflon. That's where it activates on that front F. And this is that little perma-adjust foot. Here is the bar key. Doesn't need anything except for the perma-adjust feet. Here is the B. It's got your perma-adjust foot with the, this is the area where the C sharp touches, right? And I used to do synthetic felt here, but I've found that that gets hard over time. So I've been doing cork lately, and I don't really have any regrets. And that what's missing right here is the front F. And that seems to last a long time, especially because, you know, this is a really large surface. So there's not a lot of compression that happens here. So you might want like a slightly gushier material than you might normally because of that contact area being so big. If you use like synthetic cork here, that is going to make a popping noise every time it hits, especially like, you know, if you play a C and then you add the B to get an A, you're going to hit a crack, crack, crack every time. And it doesn't need anything on the bottom because it's got the perma-adjust foot. And then here's your A. Similarly, I've got a piece of cork here, very thin, and then your perma-adjust foot. Let's go to the bell keys, which I will include the G sharp. So on the G sharp, this is a little area where you put a disc of felt. Now you don't put this on first because you need to heat the key. This is one of the discs of felt you put on after. This is where the G sharp key actually activates the G sharp touch piece, activates the G sharp pad. And what I've got here is just a little bit of Teflon laminated over this kind of like half moon shape they put on here. You don't want to put too much, you don't want to add any thickness here. This is actually a really close adjustment. You can end up, you know, you can bend this piece on the G sharp, but the less you do that, the more likely it is that this really complex mechanism here is going to work better. So I just laminate that with Teflon because it kind of slides in a weird way as it goes through. So I like to have Teflon on Teflon here. It doesn't seem to make any noise, but it makes a big difference as far as the smoothness of that mechanism having that way. And then you got your low B flat, just a tiny piece of adjustment material here on this part. I've got a thin piece of cork laminated with Teflon because as this goes through its range of motion with what activates it, it does actually slide a bit. So having a bit of Teflon seems to be good. There's a good bit of force that can be imparted here, so you don't want something too smushy. I've got just a thin piece of cork here that isn't really going to deform very much. On the low B, this gets done like a million different ways. I typically start off by just like taking a thin piece of cork or a thin piece of synthetic felt and then laminating it with Teflon, and I'll alter it if I need to. This piece is usually bent, right? Someone at some point has bent this all around, and getting that exactly right is sort of one of the major things you'll wrestle with the left-hand pinky table. So I start off like this, and maybe everything's going to work out well and this is what I'll keep. But I would not be surprised if later on, as I'm putting this together and actually, you know, where the rubber meets the road, if I'm actually going to end up modifying this and making a different choice. But that's what I'll start with. The low C sharp needs nothing except to make sure that these jaws are square. And then this is the G sharp trill actuating key. I typically put a piece of cork here, depending on how this is bent. It'll hit the body in different places. Sometimes people want it bent a ton and this will be where it hits the body. Sometimes people want it bent a little farther out because it's just about where that's actually either getting in the way or not of the rest of your fingers when you're playing, and how much people want that close at hand or more out of the way. So I'll kind of put a piece of cork here and a felt disc here. So no matter how people want this bent, it is going to have a piece of adjustment material that's going to stop it against the body. And then here, I've got a thin piece of cork with laminated with Teflon. Where this actually touches the G sharp key is right here. And so I typically put, and you can do this either way, but I typically put just like a thin piece of leather or something here just to give it like something somewhat soft but still pretty firm to hit with thin piece of cork laminated with Teflon. That'll slide really well. That'll like not feel too mushy, but that's a pretty small area where it touches, so you don't want to have stuff that's too gushy there. Moving on to the actual keys of the left-hand pinky table. The G sharp is probably the one that's like the most complex. First, go ahead and bend these. They're going to be all bent out of place, but bend these so they're just like parallel. You want like a thicker piece of material on this little tab because there's actually a cutout on the C sharp, and you want that to be level, right? See how that's level when it's touching? Now, you can put a thinner piece and then bend it way up, but I think it's a little bit better to have a slightly thicker piece with less bend in it, so you've got like more material, and that way you're going to get like less squish, right, when you've got like a larger surface area, and those two pieces are going to move together really well. We can see on the C sharp here, I've put in this little recess, I've laminated a little bit with Teflon. Because we've got different leverages here, they are going to move in a slightly different way, and there is going to be a little bit of sliding when this is actuated, like the C sharp is going to push the G sharp down. So since there's a little bit of sliding, I want to have it really, really slick if possible. So I put a little bit of Teflon right here. And we see where the C sharp actuates, the C sharp key actuates the C sharp pad. This just slides right in there. And I usually use, like, you can use, I've seen leather, I've seen cork, there's lots of different things that work. I use synthetic felt, and I just kind of wrap this, and you want it to be like a little bit tight, but not too tight. You definitely do not want any lost motion. If anything, have it start off just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit tight, because it will quickly get like sort of compressed to the point where it's working perfectly, but you do not want any lost motion, and you do not want any drag in this mechanism. The C sharp, when it's operating correctly on these instruments, is the smoothest and lightest low C sharp on any instrument. So you want to make sure that this is operating in a way that allows that to come through. So on the G sharp, we've got a thicker piece of material here for the C sharp. We've got a thinner piece of material here where the B will rest. I've got a piece of leather here for where the G sharp trill will touch it. I've got a rounded piece of cork laminated with Teflon for where this actually activates the G sharp key itself. And then a nice thick fat piece of adjustment material here. I use cork. This will get modified later on, but you want this to be pretty thick, to start off pretty thick. You can always make it thinner, right? You can sand it down. You can cut it down if it's really, really thick. But I start off with a piece of cork here, and this will end up being fairly thick. And as you are putting the instrument together and getting everything right, the C sharp does not have a stopper of its own. So the C sharp key height adjustment is determined by how far down the G sharp will go. And when everything is in proper adjustment, you don't have any lost motion with like this opening up farther than the G sharp wants to go, and your key heights will all be correct and working well, but you need to give yourself room to make that adjustment. The low B just needs a little thin piece of cork right here, because that is the adjustment that between the low B flat and the low B makes sure that they close or keeps these two pieces aligned as you press everything close. And you'll see you've got a permanent adjust foot here, permanent adjust foot here. I put a little tiny piece of Teflon on the B flat because they've got different leverage points here, so they are going to slide a little bit on that cork there, and I want to make sure that's extra smooth. You've got a permanent adjust foot here and a permanent adjust foot here on the B flat. All right, let's get these out of the way. And look at the lower stack. So this is the alternate E flat. Nothing needs to go on here. It's got a permanent adjust foot. The F sharp, we've got two like recesses in the bar. It looks a little weird to have it on the back, but the way they set up is this way, right? So when the F goes down, presses the F sharp down from the back. So I've got a thin piece of cork here, thin piece of cork here, nice and flat. pretty big surface area. You don't want something that's going to make a lot of noise again. So I use regular natural cork, which holds up really well over time. This is a little bit weird on the bis connection. You've actually got a set screw here and a screw here that you screw this in and out, and this is a spring, like a little leaf spring. And that is an adjustment to, like that's the adjustment to connect the F sharp to the bis, so that when the F sharp closes, it closes the bis for your 1-in-1 fingering. Now we saw earlier that I had a piece of Teflon on the bis. I put a very, very thin piece of cork on this spring here. It's thinner than you think. It really does, for some reason. I'm not sure if it's just the angles or whether the spring is like, even when it's, you know, this little screw is pushing the spring out, if it's like providing some sort of dampening effect, but that is often not loud at all, even though you might expect it to be. And if you put too thick of a piece of material here, it won't work very well. So this is a very, very, very thin shaving of cork that I've put on here just for silencing. And I will also take like a little bit of cork grease and put it on here. And between this really, really thin piece of cork with a little bit of cork grease, and it's very, very flat and smooth. I cut it with a really, really sharp blade, so it's got a very, very smooth face. That will slide on that bis really, really well and be quiet and not be too thick that I can't actually use this piece of it, that can't actually use this adjustment, because I do think it's important for this spring to not be laying flat against this bar here. Also, you've got a perm adjust foot here. That's what goes against the G sharp. So later there'll be a piece of felt here, and you put that on after the G sharp is seated. So that's the F sharp. Here's the F. No materials, just perm adjust feet on the back. That's for the height. That's for the relationship between the F and the F sharp. Same with the E. No materials, just the perm adjust feet, front and back. And then this is the E pearl, which also, you know, is separated because of the E flat trill. So the E flat trill, this is for the, so on the E pearl, there's going to be a piece of felt here, but I leave that off until I've actually seated that pad. On the upper stack, you can have this on because you can actually just flip the key over while you're doing pad work and then flip it back if you want to, or you can put it on later so that it stays away from the heat. But on this one, you can't. There's no room between the bell and the lower stack. So I'll put a felt disc here later. This is a piece of thin cork laminated with Teflon. And what this is doing is interacting with the alternate E flat. And this does a lot of sliding as it goes through its range of motion. So you definitely want to have a nice, smooth perm adjust foot here. And you want to have this laminated with Teflon, and you don't want it to be too smushy either. And then this is the low D. Got a perm adjust foot on the back and felt disc here, and that holds down the E right here. And I find that you can have the felt on here and do your pad work without it being too much of an issue, as long as you're just even moderately careful with where your heat travels. So that is the key work. Let's get out the body. All right, so I have done a lot of, but not all of my dent work. But you've got these areas on the body, just like we saw in the G sharp, where you clean these out, and I put a little disc of felt in here, and I iron it nice and flat. Now you want that to be, you don't want it to sit too proud. Just a little bit is fine. I've seen people try this with cork, but it gets pretty bouncy and loud. Synthetic cork, same thing, it's a bit too firm. So I think regular felt, high quality, dense felt, punch it out, and then adhere it with contact cement, and then iron it nice and flat. And you've got 1, 2, 3 in the upper stack. And then down here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1 for, I believe that is the B flat, the height adjustment on the B flat spatula right there. And so I've done a lot of the dent work, not all of it. I've got a few more things to do, but pretty soon I'm going to be started on pad work here. So you kind of, you disassemble, you clean, you get everything super, super clean, including the little perm adjust feet and all the pivot screws and the locking screws and, you know, the hinge rods, that is a job in itself on these. You've got 4 times as many of those parts to clean and get the rust off and straighten as you do on a normal saxophone. That's kind of a whole job in itself. And once you've got everything straightened out, then you do the adjustment materials, and then it's pad work. And the pad work is done in an unusual order as well. You actually start with the left-hand pinky table. You install it, you do the left-hand pinky table work. That's the G sharp, the C sharp, the low B flat. You get that perfect, and then you take it off. And then you do the rest of the horn. And then at the end, you put that completed stuff back on, because there's no way to get to all the stuff when everything, especially, you know, all of the relationships in here between these spatula keys and their distinct and separated pad keys, you really can't get to them if the rest of the instrument is together. So you do that first, get it perfect, take it off, do the rest of the horn, put them back on. This is what I mean when I say you can reverse this key so the felt doesn't burn while you're doing your work, right? So you can do all your pad work and all your setup, and then you just take the rod out and put it back in after flipping this over. And here we are, all done. Here's the neck. I'm pretty pleased with how the neck came out. Didn't think I was going to get this good of a result, but I like it. Doesn't look too bad. Now I've just finished this, so I'm pretty happy with the horn, but I always go back over it, like especially on a huge job like this. I always go back over it a few days later. Just sort of like come at it with like fresh eyes, but we ended up with everything being pretty much, I didn't make too many adjustments to the materials I had installed. One thing I did was this came out a lot thinner on the E. This had been bent a lot, and by the time I got everything kind of lined up, like you see here, and the key height where I wanted it, that ended up being a much thinner piece of material. These little guys here, I shaved down a little bit more than we saw earlier to make them as free as I wanted once they were fully installed. These got sanded down, but we expected that. The like little arm here underneath the B that I was saying like is kind of always messed up. I ended up putting a little bit of a bend in that to get it to be where I wanted to. But, you know, that table's nice and flat, looks pretty good, nice and smooth. But yeah, the materials as we installed them ended up being pretty much exactly what I needed out of the horn, which is cool because, you know, I haven't done one of these for 8 months or so. So it's always like, did I forget something? Did I mess something up? But it looks like as I showed it to you is exactly how it worked out for this horn. One thing I'd like to point out is on the G sharp, this little arm here, if I didn't mention it earlier, it's part of this key. I'm sorry, this key. Well, I guess there's still stuff moving. It's part of this key. And this little arm here is actually the way that you adjust the relationship between like where this is at rest when it is contacting the G sharp and holding it shut. You can put a thicker material on the bottom of this here, but also the original intent was to give you a little bit of room after you do that to bend this up and down. Now you don't want to do it too much obviously, but that is the original intent of how that adjustment works. It's always a little bit weird to bend stuff, but on older horns you find that a little more often than you do on modern horns. So that is a Conn 30M. The 26M is very, very similar. Hopefully you find that helpful, useful, informative. This was aimed at a very, very narrow audience, but based on the amount of calls I get worldwide for working on these, it seems like, you know, something like this might be helpful for other repairers that are working on these, that are familiar with repair, but have not worked on a 26 or 30M, because it is just a little bit stranger, a little bit more different, a little bit more, sort of sleuthing and intuition needed to get them playing the way they can play. But once they're set up well, once they play the way they can, they're fantastic instruments. So hope you found that helpful, useful, informative. My name is Matt Storr. I repair saxophones for a living. Thanks for watching.